The return turned inward arrives after the spiral bloom has expanded you outward into effortless generosity. It comes quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, as a subtle pull back toward the depths of your own being. The outward radiance has done its work. You have expanded, shared, overflowed, and stabilized. But the spiral never stops moving, and its motion now curves inward, not as collapse, not as retreat, but as a deeper spiral into the interior where everything you have expressed must be reclaimed, integrated, and anchored at the core. This is the stage where you stop seeking escape and begin spiraling from within. In the earlier stages, your seeking was pointed outward, toward knowledge, toward teachers, toward signs, toward alignment in the external. Even the bloom, though effortless, still carried a sense of expression into the world. But here, the spiral begins to shift your center of gravity. You start to notice that external confirmations no longer satisfy. Applause feels hollow. Recognition feels irrelevant. Opportunities lose their glitter. Not because they are unworthy, but because you have tasted something more substantial: inner coherence. You begin to crave not expansion into the world, but depth into yourself. The spiral is no longer pulling you outward. It is drawing you home. This inward return is not regression. It is not the collapse of the bloom. It is the maturation of it. What blossomed outward must also be rooted within, or else it will wither. The spiral ensures that your expansion does not float away into abstraction, but anchors into essence. This anchoring requires solitude, silence, and honesty. You find yourself less interested in proving anything, less concerned with showing growth, less entangled in demonstrating expansion. Instead, you are absorbed by the quiet question: what remains when all expression falls silent? This is the heart of the return, turning away from outward validation to inward integration. At first, this can feel like loss. After the radiance of the bloom, the inward turn may feel like contraction. You may wonder if something is wrong. Why does the light feel dimmer? Why does the world feel less alive? Why does the expansion that once flowed so freely now feel redirected? But the spiral is not extinguishing your light. It is guiding it inward, condensing radiance into core fire. The outward glow prepared you. Now the spiral wants you to discover that your essence burns without needing to shine for anyone else. The return teaches you to be radiant in solitude, luminous in silence, expansive without witnesses. The ego often resists this stage. It was comfortable being admired, celebrated, noticed. It enjoyed the ease of opportunities and the magnetism of blooming. Now when attention fades, it panics. It interprets the return as loss of momentum, decline, even failure. But the truth is that what feels like decline is actually descent. You are being led deeper, not diminished. The spiral teaches you here that real sovereignty is discovered when you no longer need external mirrors. The return severs dependence on outer reflection. It confronts every place where your worth was still tethered to response, and in this confrontation it gifts you the deepest freedom, the ability to spiral purely from within. As this stage matures, you begin to experience a profound intimacy with yourself. Not the self you constructed for the world, not the identity shaped for recognition, but the self that remains when no one is watching. You discover your own inner resonance as sufficient, even abundant. The conversations you once sought outside now occur within. The guidance you once chased in signs now arises directly from silence. The return reveals that the spiral has always been within you, and all outward expressions were reflections of this inner movement. Now the reflections fade so you can see the source directly. This stage is also marked by a change in desire. External ambitions lose their hold. Even spiritual ambitions, the hunger for experiences, visions, breakthroughs, begin to dissolve. You no longer crave peak states. You begin to desire depth instead. Stillness becomes more satisfying than ecstasy. Silence becomes more clarifying than revelation. The spiral turns you inward so that you learn to value essence over spectacle, depth over display, being over becoming. You realize that the truest expansion is not measured by how much you radiate outward, but by how deeply you anchor inward. The return also transforms your relationship with emptiness. Where once emptiness felt threatening, now it feels alive. you discover that silence is not void but fullness in disguise. Solitude is no longer loneliness but intimacy with being itself. This is the paradox of the return. You discover that what appears as less is actually more. What feels like nothing is actually everything condensed into stillness. The return rewrites your perception of fulfillment, teaching you that the deepest nourishment is found not in constant expression, but in resting within the core of your own resonance. This inward turning does not separate you from the world. It unifies you with it more profoundly. As you spiral inward, you discover that the depth within mirrors the depth of all things. You no longer feel isolated because you realize that the same spiral that moves in you moves in everything. This realization births compassion that is no longer performative but rooted in essence. You do not need to demonstrate compassion, you simply embody it. The return teaches you that the deepest service to the world is not what you radiate outward, but the coherence you carry inward. Because when coherence is anchored inside, it quietly reorganizes everything outside. The return turned inward is not glamorous. It is not meant to be. It strips away spectacle so that you may discover substance. It asks you to stop looking for proof and start living from presence. It is a descent into the roots of the spiral, where the true fire burns, unshaken by applause or rejection, untouched by circumstance or recognition. It is the stage where the seeker becomes the found, where the outward journey collapses into the inward core, where expansion and contraction merge into one truth. The spiral is within you, and it has never left. The return deepens, and what first felt like contraction becomes the most profound spaciousness you have ever known. At the beginning of this stage, you may have believed the inward turn was pulling you away from life. But as you move deeper, you realize it is pulling you into life, at its source. The further inward you spiral, the more you sense the infinite unfolding contained within your own being. What once seemed like an interior descent now reveals itself as the opening of entire worlds within. The inward path is not smaller than the outward. It is vaster because it connects you to the roots from which all outward expressions rise. This phase demands radical honesty. The outward expansion of the bloom could conceal certain distortions behind generosity, beauty, and flow. But the inward return leaves nowhere to hide. In silence, every subtle attachment, every shadow of pride, every fragment of dependency is revealed. The spiral is merciful, but it is also relentless in its stripping. Here it holds up the mirror not of the world, but of your own essence. You must face where you still performed awakening rather than embodied it, where you still relied on the gaze of others to feel real, where you still mistook external flow for inner freedom. This stage is the refining fire that burns away the final illusions. Yet this burning is not violent, it is intimate. You begin to notice that every exposure, every unveiling of hidden distortion, comes with an invitation to hold yourself with compassion. The return does not shame you, it frees you. Each time you face what you once avoided, you feel the quiet strength of your own essence deepening. You realize that integrity is not about perfection, but about presence. The more present you are with yourself, the less power illusions hold. The inward spiral teaches you that the truest liberation is not found in escaping shadows, but in embracing them until they dissolve into light. In this depth, time loses even more of its grip. Days blur not because you are distracted, but because you are anchored in such steady presence that the flow of time feels irrelevant. You begin to experience life less as a sequence and more as a simultaneous unfolding. The past feels folded into the present. The future feels seated within now. You live less in anticipation and more in immediacy. This immediacy is not urgency but clarity. It reveals that the only real ground is the present, and that to spiral inward is to spiral into the eternal now. The return also reshapes your relationship with truth. In earlier stages, truth often arrived as revelation, flashes of clarity breaking through confusion. But now truth feels less like arrival and more like residence. You no longer chase truths or collect insights, instead truth simply abides. It feels less like something you grasp and more like something you rest in. This is the subtle but profound shift, the end of seeking. Not because there is nothing left to discover, but because you finally understand that discovery happens naturally when you are aligned. Seeking ends not because truth is finished, but because truth is constant. Inward turning also alters how you engage with others. You find that your relationships shift from needing others to confirm your worth, to simply sharing resonance. You no longer measure connection by intensity or frequency, but by authenticity. Silence with another becomes more satisfying than conversation filled with noise. Presence becomes more important than performance. You realize that the depth you have discovered within yourself is mirrored in every soul. and you meet others not as mirrors to validate you, but as sparks of the same spiral unfolding. This transforms community into communion, not built on exchange but on essence. The return matures into a profound rest. You stop striving for arrival. You stop chasing progress. You stop hungering for confirmation. Instead, you begin to live in a quiet sufficiency. Nothing feels missing because you finally see that what you sought outwardly has always been within. This rest is not passivity, it is power. It allows you to move in the world without being moved by the world. You act without attachment, speak without agenda, give without depletion, receive without grasping. This is sovereignty, not control over life, but freedom within life. The return teaches you that true mastery is not dominance but depth. As this stage nears completion, you begin to notice a subtle merging of inner and outer. The distinction between spiraling inward and expanding outward begins to blur. You realize that the spiral was never two movements but one rhythm, turning and returning, blooming and rooting, radiating and anchoring. You see that the inward turn was never separate from the outward. It was the completion of it. Expansion without return would scatter you. Return without expansion would isolate you. But together, they reveal the spiral's wholeness. You begin to sense that the inward spiral is preparing you for something beyond stages, for living as the spiral itself. At the deepest point of the return, silence itself transforms. It no longer feels like the absence of sound, but the fullness of being. Stillness becomes alive, vibrant, resonant. You no longer interpret silence as a pause in life. You realize silence is life in its purest form. The inward spiral dissolves the illusion that you must do, achieve, or express to be real. Being itself is enough, awareness itself is complete. The return reveals that awakening is not something you reach, but something you recognize as always here. By the end of this stage, escape no longer tempts you. You no longer dream of transcending life, escaping the body, or rising above the human condition. Instead, you feel a deep intimacy with being here. You spiral not to get away, but to inhabit more fully. You turn inward not to withdraw, but to discover that within you is the entire spiral, the whole cosmos, the infinite itself. This realization is the quiet doorway into the final stage. Because once you know the spiral lives within, the next truth is inevitable. You are the spiral. You are not awakening anymore, you are awake.